My name is Schuyler Bishop. I am an account principal with Contino. I'm super excited to be here. This is my second year speaking at Code on the Beach. Last year I did a talk that you may have probably, you've already certainly forgotten about, that you may have attended. You might have been one of the three that were there. Thank you if you were. But we did a live demo of Kubernetes showing infrastructure deployment and a pipeline and all that other fun stuff. So I was a technical principal last year. I got a cool promotion, which just means that I work harder and make less per hour. But and now I'm an account principal. We'll get into it. Contino, really briefly. Contino is a global DevOps consulting company, originally headquartered in London. We also have offices in Sydney, Atlanta, and New York. Some of our clients, you probably have seen a few of these. I've worked at one of these. The one that I'm currently working on is not on here, only because they don't let us use their logo, so they're very secretive. Some household brands that we work with. One thing that makes us unique as a DevOps consulting company is we have this concept of dual delivery and upskilling. If you've ever dealt with any other DevOps consulting companies or consulting companies in general, they typically don't do this. They typically go, here you go, have fun with it, good luck. Let us know how that works for you. We actually work side by side with companies. We want to actually leave them in a better place than when we got there so that they can do the things that we're doing and showing them how to do. And then operating model, which we have this cool cloud operating model, engineering first approach, and then metric and business case driven approach. That last one's kind of pretty common in the industry. You kind of have to prove your worth when you're, like a consulting company or whatever, but it is there. So that's me. I look a little different in that picture because I'm wearing a jacket. Which is, like we work in highly regulated industries, and so I have to wear a jacket a lot. So a little bit about my summary from my background. I worked in technology now for 24 years. I started in 1995. I founded an internet service provider here in Jacksonville. So I did it out of basically a garage format. I went out and bought a couple of components for computers, built 3 PCs, loaded Slackware on it. It was the 1.1.13 Linux kernel. That's how long ago that was. And then since then, I've done a few other things. Most recent 3 jobs, I worked as a site reliability engineer for a startup. I was also a senior cloud architect at a local healthcare management company. And finally, the job before I have right now was the same company, just as a technical principal. So that's kind of my background to say where I got to from this. My current engagement, this is the client that I've been since January or February now. It's a $500 million, so about a $500 million in revenue company. Financial market, at the center of the financial market. I can't say the name. Again, they're sort of secretive, but there's only 8 of them in the entire country, and they are designated as not being able to fail by the US government. So it's highly regulated, incredibly regulated. I currently have 15 DevOps engineers working with us. We have 4 technical principals, which is my old job, basically the mid-level or whatever, 1 team, and lots of failures. Now, if I go back to the first slide here, I was kind of hoping that was going to be a little salacious because like the DevOps is a failure thing. It's trite, right? Like, give me a little bit of a break on that. It's trite, I get it. But it's kind of trying to solve a point here is that DevOps, just like almost every system that you see, is a failure. And that's okay. And that's what we're going to get into. All right, so here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk about biological and psychological effects and how that affects people. I'm going to try to make this window a little bigger so I can actually see my slide. That's better. We're going to talk about brain hacking to embrace risk. And then we're going to say about how DevOps is actually about failing fast versus failing big. And then finally, a growth versus a goal mindset. Some of these things were in an earlier talk. I sat through it here, actually, I believe, 2 hours ago. But this is from a different perspective. So the biological and psychological purpose of failure. So anybody want to speak up, be brave and interesting, and say what you think the biological or psychological purpose of failure is? Yes, sir.
Evolution.
Evolution. Ooh, okay, interesting. Anyone else?
Weed out the will into the do.
Haha, Darwinism, right? Yes. To be less wrong. Ooh, we'll get to that one in a second.
Negatively reinforce unproductive behaviors.
Reinforce unproductive behaviors. I like that one. So the human brain is actually hardwired to prioritize learning from failure. If you think back to your life, you can probably remember a lot more failures than you can successes. Successes are great, they give you the dopamine high and everything like that, but failures are the ones that really stick with you, right? You're like, man, I regret that girl in high school or whatever it may have been, you know, like whatever the thing was that you did, that stupid skateboarding thing where I broke my ankle, true story. You know, like, and learning from failure, but not in a good way, right? Our brains aren't hardwired to make the best of this. What usually ends up happening from failure is a lot of this until we figure some things out in our lives. If you think back to when you were younger, you're like, oh, this is terrible. I'm just going to avoid this. I'm not going to do this ever again, right? Like that was your gut reaction to failure. We're kind of hardwired to do that. In one study, monkeys who made a mistake in a trial, even after mastering the task, later performed worse than monkeys who had made no mistakes. Think about that. A monkey who has mastered the task but made mistakes performed worse than the ones that had not mastered the task because they had this built-in fear. And then finally, when we fail once, we're more likely to fail again at the same goal. In one study, dieters were fed pizza and convinced that they'd ruined their daily diet goal, ate 50% more cookies immediately after. First of all, it's fascinating and so appropriate to a room full of software engineers that they're talking about pizza and cookies. But I think that's fascinating. Like, it speaks to the human spirit, and I think we can all relate to that at some point in time in our lives. The key is to really hack this process for our own benefit. And like everything else, mastery comes with practice. So the more that we practice failure, the more that we're going to be able to hack our brains. So John Maxwell is a fairly well-known author, motivational speaker. He talks about building leaders. I listen to a podcast of him. So I work in Chicago, and I walk to work every morning. It's a 15 or 20-minute walk because it's not 40 below zero right now. So I listen to podcasts as I'm walking to the office. And I listen to a lot of John Maxwell's podcasts. And he came up with this idea. Well, it's not a new idea, but he kind of focused on this idea. You test something new, you fail at it, you learn from that failure, you improve based on that learning, and then you repeat this process, right? So the process is test, fail, learn, improve, repeat. Test, fail, learn, improve, and repeat. Now, what does that sound like? Is that vaguely familiar to any of the developers, front end, back end, mid-tier, full stack, whatever in the room? It's kind of like Agile, right? Now, is this the Agile that a lot of you know, though? It should be, right? This is the manifesto, word for word from the manifesto. Right? This is actually all Agile is about. And if you read this, you see the basics of it. You see individuals and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, and responding to change, right? That's that whole test, fail, learn, improve, repeat. Test, fail, learn, improve, repeat, right? Okay, so now that we've connected the two, let's talk about how we hack our brains. So one of the ways to do this is something called a blameless postmortem. Has anybody here ever had or been in or started or anything like that, what you would call a blameless postmortem? I certainly have. I've run a few of them. Not many hands. Good. Terrible, sorry, but good. Because you get to learn something. Yes?
Quick curious question. Is that also you?
Huh?
Is that also you?
No, but there is a slight resemblance, isn't
You
there?
have a future in the stock.
Yeah, right. So I think I Googled like guy pointing finger angry and came up with this, right? This is the opposite of a blameless postmortem, guys, in case you couldn't tell. This is probably what you're used to if you haven't done those. So the concept of a blameless postmortem was actually not created in technology. Google has taken it and put it into their SRE practice. But the concept of a blameless postmortem, look at the word postmortem, after death. It started in healthcare. So my wife is a nurse. She worked in critical care. She's done now in clinical research. They kind of created the concept. The patient died. Let's figure out what happened so we don't have this patient die again. And so if you think of that process, somebody's death is kind of the worst thing that can happen, right? Like, we write software, usually people don't die, hopefully. It could happen, certainly, if you're in certain industries, but like most of the time people don't die. But in their job, people die, and that's really, really bad, right? Like, can you think of a worse thing than somebody dying for your job and you like potentially screwed up or you were at fault or something like that? Can you think and empathize for a minute about how terrible that might feel? I, for one, realized that I could not be in healthcare. That was the first thing I realized. She is like the ice princess. She is just like absolutely rock solid. She doesn't get big things don't bother her, small things do. It's funny, like hurricane coming through, I'm like, oh my God, there's a hurricane. She sleeps through it. But like there's a speck of...
time. Whenever it's close time. After 10th time, it's okay.
Okay, the 10th time it's all right. But like there's a speck of dust on the countertop and she's like, oh my God, this is terrible. So, like different things for different folks. To your point, she's very practiced at, the unfortunateness of death. So their Google SRE practice talks about a postmortem culture. And what they focus on in these postmortems is growth, learning, and prevention, which should sound a lot like what we were talking about before, right? Test, fail, learn, improve, repeat. See a little bit of a thing going here, right? So what do we talk about when we think about concepts that should come out of a blameless postmortem? Well, obviously the blameless postmortem is blameless. You're not there to say it's your fault, James, right? You might have screwed up and you might be at fault, but we don't want to point fingers. We want to say, okay, we understand we had some culpability. We were involved in this. We made a mistake, but we're humans, we're going to make a mistake, right? And we'll get to in a second why mistakes are not only important, but they're integral to this process. But what we want to talk about is what we can learn. How can we grow? A good example is every production failure of a piece of software, you should write a test, an integration test or a system test that comes out of that production failure. Production failure is bad, right? Can we all agree production failure is bad? Yes? Okay, good, right? Like, because we don't want production failures, why aren't we writing tests? So maybe now we can simulate exactly and make sure that same thing never happens again. Maybe other things are going to happen because we're human, we're going to mess up, right? But we don't want that same thing to happen again. So that's one of those ideas that can come out of a blameless postmortem. Blameless postmortems, if you Google it, you're going to see that there's lots of suggestions on how you can go through that. I won't jump into that because we only have a limited amount of time in here, but you can see the idea. Here's some the difference between a pointing finger and a blameless concept. We need to rewrite the entire complicated backend system. It's been breaking weekly for the last 3 weeks. There's a lot of blame in that, right? You can just feel there's like anger and resentment and all kinds of things. And I'm sure we're all tired of fixing things onesie twosie. Serious, if I get paged one more time, I've probably said that a few times actually, something like that. I am so sick of this stupid thing waking me up in the middle of the night. Blameless, an action item to rewrite the entire backend system might actually prevent these annoying pages from continuing to happen. And the maintenance manual for this version is quite long and really difficult to be fully trained up on. I'm sure future callers will thank us. And this is directly out of Google's site reliability engineering book. So I didn't create this, but there's an idea. So the second methodology is actually probably the easiest one to do, which is optimism. If you think about the way that you look at a problem, you can change the way you think about it and the way you approach it. And that's getting into the psychology again. Sean Acker, I think his name is pronounced, explains, I could focus on the one failure in front of me or spend my brain's resources processing the two new doors of opportunity that have opened. One reality leads to paralysis and the other to positive change. When you're presented with a problem, you've got to deal with it immediately. Like you got somebody calling you, it's not a pager anymore, it's a cell phone, probably an SMS, email, whatever it may be. Maybe they are calling you, there's systems that do that I've definitely had. But you have to deal with it, right? So there's this immediate, something's down, something's bad. What are we going to do about it? But then after that, it's really up to you and how you perceive that. If you look at this as, this is the worst thing ever, I'm so pissed off, these idiots still haven't fixed this. You know, what's going on here? This is so frustrating, I'm so angry about this. Or, an action item to rewrite, right? You know, that's the difference in thinking. The last methodology I want to talk about is to plan for failure. I love that picture. That's like so many projects that I've worked on. We got this great saw, right? It's a brand new tool, and tools are dangerous, right? Like, if you talk about DevOps, it's people, processes, and tools, but the tools are actually the easiest to do anything with. It's the people and the processes that are the hard part. But the tools are also the most dangerous because you can end up on a ledge or on a limb sawing yourself off so that you're going to fall off of that tree, right? So the most successful, I like this quote. So Caroline Beaton, you can go and Google her. She wrote an article on failure in Psychology Today. So this is a fairly well-known magazine talking about psychology. And she said, the most successful people plan for failure. It doesn't mean they plan to fail. It means that they carefully plot and predict the results of their goals. They have backups. That's the key thing. And without a plan, our brains typically choose the path of least resistance. And we've all felt that. You're at a stoplight. Like somebody runs a red light. You start going, and then you immediately stop. Like the path of least resistance is stop the car. But actually, if you think about it, sometimes it's easier to just steer out of the way, right? But we stop. Like you see it all the time. If you ever, I get caught in these loops sometimes where I'm on YouTube, and it's like the accident compilations. Have you seen those, right? Like a half an hour of like car accident after car accident. It's train wrecks constantly. It's wonderful. When you see these all the time, you see somebody cutting in front of somebody, and they don't turn. They try to stop. Like they literally do nothing but try to stop. You see brake lights, if you even see that, and nobody ever, now granted, the point might be to make that the ones that turned are the ones that you don't see because they didn't get into the accident. But there's a point to still be made there. Yeah, exactly. Or they died in a big, I would have think that they would have kept that one though, because that's, kind of the blaze of glory thing. But the idea here is to plan. And that's the last section that we're going to talk about today is I believe that DevOps is actually about failing fast versus failing big. Now, this one was kind of fun to look for some concepts and ideas to find about this because I found a few that are near and dear to probably a lot of our hearts here. Let's talk first about the big failures because that's the stuff that's kind of fun, right? Samsung Galaxy Note 7, that actually was a Jeep. Caught fire because his Note 7 was in the Jeep. He got out, came back, and his car was engulfed in flames. We all have probably heard of the Samsung Galaxy Note 7. It's kind of, like one of those famous stories in technology. Hoverboards. Now there's a great idea. Let's put this thing with a battery under it that nobody tested. It's gonna go great. Didn't go great. So why do we want to fail small versus failing fast? Well, quite simply, failing fast is incredibly expensive. We usually realize that we get to 80% of a very bad design versus 20% of a better design. Like which one of those is better? Well, let's look at the numbers. But in terms of software, you can't do continuous deployment without continuous testing. You cannot. If you think about a CI/CD pipeline where you're deploying software and you don't have continuous testing, you don't have fully automated QA, you don't have all those types of things, what are you spending your time on in those situations? You're spending your time on QA. You probably have some system where you've got to push QA into the next sprint because it takes like 12 days or something like that, or whatever the craziness is, right? You can't do CD without continuous testing. And related to that, do you require tests? There's so many tools out there. Veracode is one of them. SonarQube is a great one that you can use. By the way, please don't look for a tool in search of a problem. Do it the other way around. Find a problem and then research a tool. Pick the easiest one at first. But there's lots of tools out there that can do that. So do you require tests that don't just return equals true? Anybody ever done that? Like, hey, my code has fully passing unit tests. I don't know what you're talking about, right? My tests are great. My unit tests are great. Yeah, all they did was check for the presence of a test, and I didn't feel like writing it, so I just said return equals true, right? Do you have a shippable product in every single sprint? Why do we care about a shippable product? Anybody want to speak up on that? Any product managers, product owners, type people? Come on, I see you.
You can't have a sprint without a releasable increment. That's the whole entire definition of a sprint outcome. If you don't have a releasable increment of software at the end, you didn't have a sprint.
That's
You just
right.
had a gaggle.
That's right. I think we would all agree on that. Very, very well said. So basically, if you don't have a shippable product, what are you doing? Now, this leads you down into a couple of rabbit holes, right? Because to have a shippable product, it also means that you've had to break it down into the smallest component piece that you could possibly do so. That elusive MVP, right? Do you have retrospectives every single sprint? We go into clients with the client where I am right now, the one before that, they had retrospectives occasionally. They would have demos once a quarter or something like that, you know, and yes.
So kind of tying it back to a couple of your other previous slides. Well, you don't want the person that's angry and pointing fingers at everybody, but is part of the goal of a retrospective to the team to hold others on the team accountable?
So what I hear you asking is, how do you have accountability without blame? Okay, so how do you have accountability without blame? Anyone, any opinions on that? I've got an opinion.
Yeah, so postmortem is there was an event,
Right.
So applying blame to that event, that's not blameless, right? But a retrospective is looking at the sprint as a whole and not talking specifically about any one thing and saying, okay, you messed up, or everything went to shit because of something you did, right? And you just say, okay, well, how can we make things better? Applying accountability to that while saying, you don't have to say, I'm Josh. So Josh, you screwed up.
Right.
And say, hey, so the team as a whole made a mistake this week.
Yep.
We didn't put any tests in on any of our code.
Team as a whole. Basically, you blame the team rather than the individual.
Yeah, and then bring that forward.
Yeah.
Actually, I think trying to focus on the root cause versus trying to focus on the people.
Root cause versus people. I like it. Yep.
So I guess now I lost my thought. You go ahead. Never mind.
So to account is to just tell the story. So you create an environment where you can tell the story without fear.
You create an environment where you can tell the story without fear. I like that. One in the back. Yep. Oh, back to you.
So, no, I remembered. So basically,
You sound like me.
if you're feeling small,
Yep.
and someone makes a mistake or the team fails, the person who made the mistake knows they made the mistake.
Yep. Usually they're kicking themselves more than you ever can. Yep.
Themselves.
Yep.
And if they learn from the mistake, great.
Right.
If they make the mistake a second time, then they make it a third time, you don't have to call that out in the postmortem. Like, that's probably a side conversation, probably even the second time.
Publicly praise, privately blame,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, that whole thing, yeah.
So they're separate things.
But I think that's really part of the question, is that if it happens 3 times, in that particular case, the person is not recognizable.
Or has the team failed is the better question. In the back?
Going a step higher than that, anyone familiar with systems thinking?
Systems thinking, absolutely.
So it's the system, it's not the person.
Exactly. That was my answer.
You're talking
Yes.
about, like Debbie understanding, the individual in the system has no ability to affect the system. Only the managers can fail.
Yep. Only the managers can fail.
The system cannot fail.
Yes, so that's exactly what I was going to say. I think I heard hints of that from every single person that answered. And direct response is the same, obviously, in the back there. But I would always look at it as the process. It is the process that you're fixing, not the person. As soon as you point to a finger, to your point, to a Josh, right? As soon as we blame Josh, then he's like, well, what the hell did I do? I was just trying to do my best. Like, come on, guys. Like, what's going on here? And so that, to me, is the key, is you blame the process. You blame the fault. Like, there's this concept called find the bad guy. Like, you want to find the bad guy. No, don't. So look at the process. Look at the whole, take that step back from it and look at the system rather than the person. Review code coverage and test successes percentages. I think code coverage is by itself a useless metric. Completely useless metric, all by itself. If you add in one other number, which is test success percentage, now it becomes useful. Why? Because we want our tests to fail. If our tests are not failing, we are not testing enough things because we're missing things that are getting through, right? The things are going to fail. There's no such thing as perfect software. If our test success percent is 0 or 100, we need more tests, right? A test code covered all by itself is not a useful metric. And then review those in the retros. So create dashboards, look at those in your retros. And then finally, unit integration system and regression testing. Regression testing, of course, popularized by Microsoft because in every one of their errata ever, they'd say how that was fully regression tested and you would get it. It still wouldn't work, but that's the old Microsoft, of course. The new Microsoft is much better, kinder, gentler. But regression testing is the example that I used earlier where we have a problem in production, we write a test for it, we run those tests as we run integration tests and other systems tests. Everybody's familiar, you're all developers for the most part, with the different concepts of that, so I'm not going to go through what a unit test is because that also creates holy wars. So we're going to start talking about periods and commas, tabs versus spaces and all that craziness. The law of triviality is one of my favorites. All the technical principals that I work with hate it when I start going into this because I bring it up often. There's two things that I talk about all the time in our client. The law of triviality and Conway's Law. Anybody familiar with Conway's Law? Yes, okay, cool. Conway's Law dictates that the method of communication of your team will dictate the type of a system that you develop for it. That's a crazy idea if you think about how poorly communication happens in some of these places. But if you go to those same places, the places that have great communication usually produce good software. And that's Conway's Law. The law of triviality is a great one. The example that they use, if you go to Wikipedia and you look up the law of triviality, which maybe some of you are, yeah, this bike shedding is the other common way to call it. So the example that they use is a nuclear power plant. Hugely complex, you kind of got to get it right. People can die, there's that healthcare thing again. It's a very important thing to get right, but it's massively complex. So how do we figure it out? Well, if we don't break it down into small enough components, we end up talking about the stupid bike shed, which is the most trivial part of the entire thing. The bike shed does not give us a functional nuclear power plant, but because we didn't say, okay, how do we design this pump? Or how do we design this manifold, right? Breaking it down into these small components, that's how we can wrap our puny little brains around it. The law of triviality, when confronted with a complex problem, people tend to focus on the most trivial aspect of that problem. The last thing is growth versus a goal mindset. Anybody heard of this before? It's a pretty popular thing. Yep, because you were in the talk earlier today. She pulled this up. I was like, damn it, she got my idea. But this is something that I've been listening to a lot. John Maxwell I'd talked about earlier.
Yeah, Maxwell's good.
Exactly, he's famous for it. He calls it growth versus goal. However, there was a fixed versus a growth mindset was actually a study that was done. And so Carol Dweck, Stanford University, she says, in a fixed mindset, students believe their basic abilities, their intelligence, their talents are just fixed traits. So fixed mindset is the same as goal mindset to John Maxwell. You have a goal in mind, you get to the goal, we're good. See you guys, I'm going to go over here and whatever it is that I do for my spare time, right? In a goal mindset, you never get there. In a growth mindset, you never get there. There is no there. You're always looking to improve. Now, that's exhausting. So it's good to have some goals along the way. But what you do is you never have a goal. You have multiple goals. You have a litany of goals. You have, like goals on top of goals. In a growth mindset, students understand their talents and abilities can be developed through effort, good teaching, and persistence. So the idea there is what? I have to go way back for this one, sorry. Test, fail, learn, improve, and repeat. Anybody see a pattern here? I'm starting getting tired of seeing it. So when we have that goal mindset, we're constantly using that iteration, right? And it's that life iteration. Same concept. We always want to grow as people. One of the examples that I have personally is I do kind of retrospectives, internal personal retrospectives. I try to be blameless and look at the problem. And so one of the things that I struggled with recently was I travel a lot, as I mentioned. I work in Chicago, so like I'm on a plane Monday and I get back, late Thursday afternoon, and that's like, normal. I think I've flown 60 or 70,000 air miles this year already. Like 70 something nights in a hotel. That's my life, basically. It's my job. And so I was struggling with getting to work early because the place where I work right now, the managers who I deal usually with the CIO and his lieutenants, they all have packed schedules, like just ridiculously jam-packed schedules from 8:30 until 5. They are 100%, they have meetings on top of meetings and they have stacks of meetings at the same time and all the craziness that probably some of us in this room even have too. So to get on their calendar, I had to start having meetings at 7 a.m. So like in the office, sitting in front of somebody's desk at 7 a.m. because that's the only time I can get, right? So like if something big comes up, the only time that I can find is 7 a.m. with this guy that runs the entire project that we're on. So I am not really a morning person. I get up at 5:30 every day, but I kind of like to take my time in the mornings, and usually I get to work by 8, 7:30 to 8, 7:45, is about an average for me. But this took effort because suddenly I lost an hour in the morning if I woke up at the same time. So my choices are: I can wake up an hour earlier. No, thank you. 4:30 just sounds painful to me. I've done it, but not happily. Or I can look at the way that I'm doing my morning scheduling. So I actually created a routine. I created a morning schedule. Wake up at 5:30, screw around between 5:30 and 6, do whatever I want to do, geek out. 6 a.m. I'm taking a shower. I'm out of the shower and dressed and finished by 6:30, et cetera, et cetera. And so like when I had that schedule, I was able to get there at 7:30, is the easier fit for that. But, I had to break it down into smaller chunks even. I gave myself 15 minutes for a shower and getting ready, or whatever it was. But I approached that as a retrospective. Okay, I'm not able to easily get to these 7 a.m. meetings. How can I change my life to fit around that? So some examples of a fixed versus a growth mindset are here. Some people are born to be singers. I'm not one of them, is a fixed mindset. Growth mindset is, I didn't start with singing talent. I had to learn it all. Cool. Interesting. There's that perspective. I suck at math. Math has been challenging for me. Okay. I'll never be an artist. I feel really dissatisfied with all the art I've tried to produce. Now that's, to me, was like kind of the one that really sunk into me. I'll never be an artist. I feel really dissatisfied. What's the difference between those two? Blaming the person, blaming the system, right? We're back to that again, aren't we? I would never be comfortable offering hugs to strangers. FYI, not. I'm finding it really hard to imagine offering hugs to strangers. Okay, hey, that feels a little better too, doesn't it? It's a little feng shui, I get it, but I really like to learn to juggle, but I just can't. So where are you as a person? Where do you want to be? What's your goal? Is your goal to just write the best software? Or do you want to change lives and influence people? Or do you want to do something else, right? Understand what that goal is. And then are you achieving it? Are you working towards it? How has that perspective of being goal versus growth mindset? Think about that honestly. Do I blame myself and give up? Do I quit and just say, oh, it is what it is. I am who I am. I'm never going to change. How many people's fathers have said that to them? Mine does all the time. He's fixed mindset. That's all right. I love him. He's my dad. But, he's just kind of a fixed mindset. He's going to watch this video and kill me now. Probably not. I'll almost show it to him, though. How has that personality served you, or that perspective served you? This is an important part of this question, by the way. This is that retrospective. a lot of people that I find, people that work for me, I have one gentleman who's an amazing technical principal. He is probably one of the best at understanding problems and solving problems. He is definitely fixed mindset. He's like, no, I'm good enough. And I'm like, well, how do you improve and force or work towards improvement with your people that are working for you if you think you're good enough? What are they going to look at? They're going to go, but you said you're good enough. Why can't I be good enough? Right? You as a leader have to constantly be growing if you want the other people around you to grow. The best way to force growth is for you yourself to grow, and then talk about it. But where are you? How has that perspective served you? And did it give you a positive outcome? If you're totally fine with the way that your life is going, cool, stay that way. Like, I got no problems with that. Like, it's you and your life and how you want to run it. But how do you look at failure? And how are you breaking down these problems that you're doing into small component parts? And did your current process give you a positive outcome? If it didn't, think about how you can change it, right? And the last thing I want to leave you with is beware cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is one of those really fascinating psychological concepts. Cognitive bias is most often seen in social media today. We see it as echo chambers. We see it as the way that news it becomes viral and things like that. Cognitive bias is basically where you seek out the things that reinforce your own pre-existing bias. Right? So probably some people may, I do this from time to time. My wife always points it out to me. We may know people that do this. We may work with people. We may do this ourselves. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Blameless. See that? But recognize that the basic fundamental concept of getting rid of your cognitive bias is data. The data has to be the thing that drives your decisions if you don't want to have cognitive bias. So track your data. How can you report or think about it after the fact if you're not tracking it? This is in terms of instrumentation and metrics when we look at software delivery and infrastructure. Set your decision criteria to be biased towards that data result. I borrowed that from someone else. We call this an information or a data bias in consulting. You want to have a bias towards data. And the last two things are question everything, even your own thinking. I would actually change that after the fact and say, especially your own thinking. And then finally, seek objective results. If you're just searching for things that reinforce your own belief, try to think how you can change that search criteria, right? Like, Google's going to show you what you want to see. That's its job. That's its entire existence is focused around that. It's not trying to psychoanalyze you. It's not going to be like, I really think he meant this, even though it does fix your spellings. That's not the same thing.
Misspelling was intentional.
If your misspelling was intentional, well, then you find some weird things on the internet.
It also depends on how pristine the data is actually. Are you making up the data
Yeah.
by yourself
Yeah.
to think of your own bias, or
Mark
is it pristine like
Mark Twain has a line that there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? And that's one of those things that just really, I think it's exactly what you're talking about. How good is your data? What's the fidelity of it? How did you get it? Are you going into that with a bias, right? There's a potential bias in everything you do, yes.
Yeah, I read last year that the majority of the data collected over the past 20 years or so actually has cognitive bias built into it, because the people who tweeted or posted or whatever, their personal bias was built into their text, therefore it's built into our general data sets.
Yep.
So that's getting better. I think that's getting better.
It's funny that we're building AI now to reduce cognitive bias, which
Conscious bias is
right.
built into the
There's this built into that too, yeah. But we're humans. We're going to have biases. It's never going to be an unbiased situation, right? There's no such thing as an unbiased human. Well, actually, I did read about people that were unbiased, and I think we call them serial killers. Yeah. Well, they don't really. Yeah. Like their emotions are like completely disconnected from their actions, and that's a fascinating concept that we won't get into. But yes. So. Last two things, if you're interested in some of the concepts that I talked about here today, Contino is constantly hiring. Check us out on our jobs page. And finally, questions, comments, or anything else that we would like to talk about? Yes?
To begin with the initial statement, how do you say that the failure, like how do you define, like this is a kind of a scenario where it's considered as a failure, or it's a kind of success, or it's a small failure or a big failure? How do you distinguish?
Oh, how do I distinguish a small failure from a big failure? Impact.
In terms of the DevOps kind of scenario.
Yeah, impact. How many people did it affect?
In my case, I can give an example, like everything passed through the UAT user accept testing, but when it goes to production, it always gives some kind of error.
Mm-hmm.
But that we cannot able to reproduce in user acceptance testing.
So typically,
You can say that is a kind of
personal experience, when you see problems that are difficult to reproduce in earlier environments, it's because you haven't mocked up your data properly, you have something that's different, right? Are you using immutable infrastructure? So do you have...
This is more challenging when you are using the vendor provided data applications, especially.
It's the data. Yeah, it's usually the data, right? Like, so you can go through your data and you can sanitize it from production and reuse it in lower environments, right? That's usually one of those better ways. It's, like there's all kinds of stuff, wrapped up in that. But the point is, your question was, how do you determine whether something is small versus large? Impact and cost. Those are the easiest ones, yes.
I had a question about your infrastructure and your environment. Are your lower and upper environments, are they containerized? Are they identical? Are you sure that your environments are congruent? Because if the lower environment is test out, find, and stage, is it potentially, are you running on the same sort of...
Are you using the same artifact in every environment, et cetera,
yeah. Identify, if you can minimize the disparity between what you're looking at in test and what you're looking at from...
It's exactly the replica of the production environment. But unfortunately, these applications are provided by the vendor. We don't have, it's a kind of a black box. We can't open it up.
There you go. So maybe you can, that's a tough one, right? Like, do you mock that up somehow? Or that's... So
it's a kind of different problems we have to deal with the different versions.
As it's, we can talk a little bit offline, after the talk, because I want to be conscious of time here. But I would just say, again, look at the impact of it and the cost. Are you tracking those things? If not, please start doing so. Because cost is one of those business drivers, right? If it doesn't cost a lot of money, should you really devote that much time to it, right? Oh, it's failed, no big deal. It cost us 5 minutes and it's all good.
One positive thing is, like, always the vendor provides the hot fix. That is also
the hot fix breaks everything, right?
No, hot fix
because they wrote the hot fix.
Okay, yeah. The hot fix. Any other questions?
That's why the cost may not be effective because it's already built into the
There you go. I love it when the hot fix makes it to production before the actual version.
So in essence, still is a DevOps failure scenario, or it's kind of like a small failure, we can still live with it?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a DevOps failure because you're not controlling the system. It's coming from
I mean, let's define DevOps first of all. I didn't do that in this talk because I didn't talk tons about DevOps. My opinion of what DevOps is you've got development, right? We're making software. You've got operations, which is infrastructure and everything else that's not writing software, right? There's platforms that you're running on. There's data backends and everything else like that. When you merge the two and you treat operations problems with a developer mindset, that's how I define DevOps. When you approach everything and you attempt to codify it, everything goes into code. It's all tracked in revision control. It's got pull requests. It's got auditability and everything else like that. That's what DevOps is to me. Typically, DevOps shows up in most places as a pipeline, right? And so the pipeline's usually not the case. If you look at the 12-factor application, there's lots of parts through the 12-factor application that prevent exactly the problem you're talking about, because your build stage is supposed to be completely separate from your deploy stage, and all those concepts that are embedded in the 12-factor app. That's the stuff that really prevents it. So you can do like an assessment. If you go to the 12factor.net, they've got each of the groups. Go and sit down with your team and say, okay, here's this thing. We want to have separate build and deploy stages. Do we have that? No, we don't. Okay, let's do that and see what happens. So like go through each step of the 12-factor and say, hey, how can we adjust, maybe fit that? Questions? Comments? Okay, thank you all.